Hello and welcome back to the Scottish Youth Work podcast, where we explore the fantastic impact of youth work in Scotland. I'm Kenny Cameron, and today I'm joined by the fantastic Innes Burns. How's it going, Innes?
Not too bad, the fantastic Mr. Burns. That's the first time I've been introduced as that.
There you go, all the formalities are out the way. Innes, you host a successful political podcast, Untribal Politics, and you're also a sessional youth worker at the Citadel Youth Centre in Leith in Edinburgh. So tell us a wee bit about yourself and how you found yourself in the youth work sector.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to my youth actually, Kenny. I used to go to the Activator youth camp at Gracemount Leisure Centre, and I loved it. I just loved going there. Went there every summer, got on really well with the staff, and I ended up volunteering there myself every summer just because I loved working with kids and everyone that was there. So I did that every summer, and I've always enjoyed working with kids. I used to work at Mackenzie School of English, which is just around the corner from here, down in Leith. Unfortunately, that's no longer with us as an institution. And I've always been one for giving back to my own community as well. I've always got a sense of pride with that. So I looked at opportunities that were available to me in Leith to give back to my community. I came across the Citadel and continued that youth work for there, but it's always something that I've done.
I do have to throw that in there because you mentioned that you're proud of your community, and obviously you're a big Hibby, and with the Citadel being in Leith, and you're a Leither yourself, hence why I've got my maroon jumper on today. I thought I'd fire that in the early and get the banter going. But
it's a testament to how much I like you, Kenny, that I'm letting you sit here with the maroon and white jersey.
Happy days.
But no, yeah, I listen. Leith has been where I've lived for the past sort of 7 years or so, and it's got a special place in my heart, obviously, because my football team's here. And I've always felt that sense of community here, so to be able to give back is great.
I know, you hear that for a lot of youth workers, that how they get into youth work is that they've been a participant and they've potentially volunteered and they want to give something back to their community, so well done to you on that. Today we are obviously going to be speaking about one or two topics that's really close to our hearts as youth workers. Obviously how youth work is not only transforming young people's mental health, or is it, but also that it makes our streets safer and it's inspiring new generations. And we came up with this topic because I put it to you. What did you want to speak about? I'm big on that with the guests because I want the show to be for youth workers, by youth workers. So you've obviously got things that you want to say to the public, to youth workers on these topics. So we'll delve into that into a wee minute. But if we're looking, then think back to yourself, if you didn't mind. You talk about your experience of being a young person in youth work and then volunteering, then into employment. If you reflect back, as we do as youth workers, how do you see youth work playing a role in your own mental health, either growing up or laterly in life?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, obvious answer is just it's been really important. I mean, I think that not only for a sense of escapism for your going to school and everything that comes with it, it can be a bit of a pain at times as a kid. But I think it's so key to your development. I think in terms of the social interaction it gives you, expanding your mind beyond what school teaches you as well, it's all important in your development. I think back to my days as a kid, especially when I was at Gracemount. When the summer was over, and like I wasn't going to these camps anymore, I always felt really sad that it was over because I wasn't able to play outside, or some people went back to school, some people hadn't, and you were sort of just reminiscing over the summer, like, I wish it hadn't ended. And kids should always have that feeling. We mentioned Leith. I tend to walk around Leith these days. I never ever see kids playing at all, and that's really striking to me. I mean, I was always into football. I always played football. My dad wouldn't have it any other way with me not playing football. That was just how it was in my household. And that was such a benefit to me personally, because a lot of my mates, by the time they were 14, 15 and been hitting the drink or whatever, going to parties, and they never had any sort of sense of purpose in the weekend aside from that. So they might as well, they might as well stand outside the shop and wait for someone to get cans for you because there's nothing else better to do. But I always played football. I always had that in my mind. And my dad was always relatively strict with me with that. If I had a game, I was in on a Friday night by a certain time. If I was socialising with my pals, it was regimented because I had the game. The big focus was playing football, and as much as that annoyed me as I started to get into my elder sort of teenage years, I really look back and I'm grateful for it, because that kept me grounded and it kept me fit as well. So as much as growing up is part of life in these teenage years, and part of that's going to parties or whatever and socialising, I think keeping yourself grounded and keeping your head in something outside of school is massively important as well. And looking back on my own personal mental health, I think that benefited me a lot, because I was exercising. We know exercise is good for mental health. I was socialising with a group who were all into football, and you get that sense of community and team spirit and all that, especially when you're doing well. So that was all massive for me when I was younger. And when I look back, if I didn't have that, I wonder what I'd be doing in those hours, at the weekend.
I think, see, you talk about football, and obviously in my other part of my life I'm a football coach and a big football fan, and I don't think football or sport in general gets the credit enough in terms of youth work and what it brings in terms of youth work, right? Because everything you've mentioned there, the making pals and keeping fit and your mental health and all that, that's all youth work. The informal learning in terms of building resilience and learning it in defeating and learning in victory, and these are life lessons. Absolutely. Even going along when you didn't quite fancy it, but you're still going along.
That's it, mate. Yeah, 100%. Because I think back to times where I had mates that at the time at a pivotal point where I think I was about 14, 15, and you get you're thinking about fucking lasses and all that. Like mates are going to parties, people are hanging about, and you didn't want to go to training, but you need that drive, and you need someone to say, no, you're going to training tonight, you need to do that. That's so important. And yeah, you're right, these do teach you life lessons, because if you don't embed that in your routine early doors, then how can you expect to look after yourself when you're older? You know what I mean? And I think about myself now and the things that make me happy. I miss playing football so much. It's exercise that what keeps my mental health in check these days. So you need to implement these patterns early doors, or we're not really setting kids up for a healthy lifestyle in adulthood.
It's interesting. I was actually walking the Pentlands with my pal Darren on Saturday morning, and we were talking very similar to that. We were talking about how, especially as we got older, we didn't do the things that make us happy often enough.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ironically, right. And we're talking. We're on the Pentlands and we're chewing the fat about a number of issues, just a number of things, just catching up. I just remember thinking how happy and sort of free and relaxed I was feeling at that time. I think, what's your take on, when you look at youth clubs? We've talked about football there, but actual youth clubs, because I would argue that's what youth clubs are. It's a place that welcomes young people in to meet their pals, to challenge adversity, to challenge your thinking on certain aspects of society or their life or whatever. That's got to play an impact on people's mental health, just having that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, school can be brutal as well. Like, you get bullies in school. I can't imagine how amplified that must be with mobile phones now, where everything's on film. You can't even move or do anything without being recorded or worrying that something's going to go viral on social media. That fear, on top of people that are like bullies and everything that goes with school, you need a form of escapism. And this is why youth clubs are so important. If they don't have those hours of the day where people are reaching out to them and they're injecting a bit of fun in their life through their community, then I wonder that we're setting up a perpetual sort of cycle of bad emotions.
I think one of the things I say to my youth work team, and they're fantastic, right, but I say to them every day, can we make the young person's interaction with you now the best part of their day? Now, it might not be. Hopefully it's the worst part of the day. They've had a great time, but hopefully their life's that good that it's just another good thing in their day, right? Yeah. But as a minimum, can we aim for it to be the best part of their day? But we also have to be, we can't be, as youth workers, I think we're really romantic in terms of going, youth work solves this and we do this and we're kind of superheroes because we got on our young people's level and they can come and they can have fun. But we can't hide for the fact that bullying takes place in youth clubs and bullying takes place in the community and all that. Do you think that how that bullying's dealt with in a youth work setting is different to, for example, at school or maybe at home, for example?
Probably. I mean, I've not been at school for a while, so I can't. I
Me
mean,
either.
yeah. So it's different rules, of course. I mean, we had a kid just a few weeks ago that punched a lassie in the face at our club because he came to the club and he didn't like his haircut, so he had his hood up the whole time, and these young lasses they kept pulling it down, and eventually snapped, and he punched her in the face, and that was the first moment where I was like, whoa. I was like, he's in trouble here. He ended up running away. He was all right in the end, and we dealt with it through the parents. He wasn't allowed back until he came, and he had to apologise to the lassie as well. So these are the kind of lessons that you learn outside school as well. I'd imagine school might be a little bit stricter in that regard. I think you're seeing a lot more exclusions at school these days. I think those percentages are going up. And this leaves kids out to dry. So youth clubs are incredibly important in picking these kids up, not neglecting them, and making sure that they learn a lesson from actions like that. Because if not, then they lose out with time spent like having fun with their pals. You know what I mean? So
It's funny you mentioned that. We were talking to young people the other day, and we had with a guy, Graham Armstrong, and he wrote the young team, and he's doing a tour now, speaking to young people about his experience of gang culture, and then going to university and having that one person that believed in him, going to university and doing well with his book and whatnot. And he was telling the young people that he had been excluded from school 7 times, and the young people burst out laughing, right? Because they're going, only 7 times. And I was like, guys, you have no idea how hard it was to get excluded, right? 15, 20 years ago from school, right? Yeah. You pretty much had to kill somebody, right, to get excluded for a bit. So 7 times was actually quite a lot, sort of in hindsight. But whereas, whether it's right or wrong now, the perception certainly is that young people are out maybe on part-time timetables more, or maybe not attending school quite as much. See, when you talk about that in terms of that conflict that happened there, that puts me in mind of another thing. I know a young guy who he had fell out with all his mates, right? And we talk about the impact of youth work. There had been a fallout. It was over something. If it happened in a youth club or supported by youth workers, it would have been over and done with in less than a day, right? Because you would have had that somebody facilitate that conversation between the two of them to find some common ground to make up and process it and move on, right? Because to both parties it was a big deal, right? But honestly, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't horrendous, right? It was a misunderstanding, as these things normally are, etc., etc. And it always put in mind to me that laddie, nobody spoke to him for a year. Literally a year. They'd walk past him in the street, in the school, literally a year. And then, as a result of that, he then obviously didn't start doing other things that you're talking about at school and all that. And he just disengaged from everything and went right within his cell. Whereas I think, had he been at a youth club, and in the area that he grew up, there was nothing. There was nothing for the young people, genuinely nothing. And it's still, to this day, I can't quite get my head around having a tune with that population. There's nothing for young people, but that's how it is. It's the reality. But I remember thinking, had there just been a youth club or a couple of youth workers that could have got them two together, that would have been sorted in a couple of hours. Everybody would have understood everybody else's viewpoint, and then this guy wouldn't have walked about on his own for a year. And we talk about mental health. Can you imagine sitting at the bottom of the stairs in school and everybody walking past you? And you'd previously been quite popular. And then suddenly not a single person speaks to you. The only person that speaks to you is the teacher when they're telling you to sit in that chair or whatever. So I think that is the one that always sticks in my head as being quite a powerful message, like how youth work could play a really important role in helping somebody, in particular their mental health, just facilitating conversation and being a go-between between conflict with young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a pattern that I see in the youth club that I volunteer at is that once you're doing an activity which with them that's fun, they tend to open up about things as well. Like if you're cooking something, making smoothies, or playing football, or doing whatever that we do at the youth club, usually they tend to open up and they speak about their day and what's been going on. And I'm not too sure they get that in school. I think school is, we still live in an education system which punishes kids quite a lot. I know it's reforming and there's a lot more holistic learning these days, but kids aren't going back to something that for a lot of kids they enjoy. So the threat of being disciplined or excluded from a class isn't as, kids might not see that as something that's bad for their
It's
day.
a bonus, eh?
That's
Let's
a
be honest,
bonus,
it's a bonus,
like,
eh?
loads of kids don't want to go to school. But in that youth club environment where people like myself, they confide in, and you develop quite personal relationships with these kids, and they do look up to you, and they don't want to disappoint you, because I could tell by the young lad's face as soon as he did it, he was petrified, because he knew he'd let me down, he knew he'd let everyone down. And I think you get that special relationship that perhaps a lot of these kids don't have with their teachers. And a lot of kids have a lot of issues going on just now. You point to the pandemic. I think there's a lot of mental health issues that have went through the roof amongst kids. I think kids are more anxious. We're finally diagnosing more kids with things like ADHD, which is really important, because kids just feel like there's something wrong with them if they can't do something, but it's not, just part of how their brain develops, and they need to learn a different way to everyone else. But school can make them feel excluded in that sense. So there's a lot to dislike about school for young kids, and that's not the school's fault entirely. But I think you get that deeper sense of relationship because you're presenting an hour or two for them of fun and socialising, that they can learn a lot from that as well.
I think there'll be any youth workers listening right now, they'll be nodding when you're talking about standing cooking or doing these activities that are kind of one-to-one, because that's, people look at that, they're just playing pool, or they're just playing FIFA, or they're just cooking, whatever. We know that's when the magic happens, because it's all relationship based. And I think people talk a lot about youth work being young people led, but I actually believe that it's more relationship led. It's a transaction two-way. You're on an even keel. Nobody's above anybody in a youth work setting. You know what I mean? You're there to keep them safe, absolutely, but other than that, it's to facilitate space for them. What do you think then? So that's all very well and good for the people who access youth clubs, right? Ian Corbett tweeted, or replied to a tweet of mine the other day that I'd put out, just asking a question about youth work and mental health, and he had made the point that young people are saying to him that youth work's almost becoming, you can only go if you're signing up to groups, so you can't ever just go in and catch a youth worker one-to-one. You've always got to go in groups. It's always targeted youth work now. What's your take on that, in terms of, have you noticed a change for it being open provision or street work into more targeted work?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm only in my mid-20s. I've not been in the profession for very long. It's always been very much a volunteer basis. It's not been a huge part of my week. I can only speak for the Citadel at the moment, and we do a lot of one-to-one work. We're fortunate that we've got volunteers like myself there that a lot of times are extra added staff that can spend one-to-one time with a kid if they're not really feeling included in the group work, because you tend to get cliques of kids as well, and with that leaves kids that are just on their own and not really knowing where to go. But I think the benefit of centres like the Citadel is they've got keen volunteers like myself who are able to see a kid and spend one-on-one time with them, and that's really important. But yeah, you're right, especially with these centres that are clearly strapped for cash. We've had a decade of austerity, and there's not enough youth workers out there, so yeah, we definitely do have that problem, and that might exclude kids. But to speak to a general trend, I probably don't have the knowledge for it, truth be told.
Ian really made me think about that, because again, we're all singing, all dancing, but we're really good at patting ourselves on the back, and that's, to be fair, that's on the back of young people telling us that we're doing what we need to do for them, right? So I get that, but it did get me thinking of that. But what about the young people that aren't coming, and the ones that we are missing, and what do we need to do to get them in, because they'll need that support. They'll have their mental health things on the go. And so how do we entice young people that maybe didn't traditionally access what we'd call traditional youth work, so away for the football, coming into youth clubs? How do you think we could attract maybe them young people into youth centres?
I guess accessibility would be the big thing. We say traditional youth work, but maybe the answer is non-traditional youth work. Maybe it is places like Samaritans, where they've got a massive community centre, and involving kids, utilising places like that to involve kids, because I look at football now, and it actually costs quite a lot to play football if you want to play for a team. So I think enticing kids through these big places, maybe subsidising clubs like Spartans to involve their community and put on a club at some point during the week, then that can certainly be done. But yeah.
As I was thinking about it, one of the big things that, again, sitting reflecting after reading that comment, I can't imagine if you're going to a funder, for example, right, and you're saying, right, we've had X amount for you this year, and we've worked with 8 young people. And I just didn't know, because I'm not a funder, right? And I would love to actually interview a funder one day. It'd be interesting to get their take on youth work in Scotland, right? But I'm not sure how a funder would take saying, we've worked with 8 young people, but really intently in youth work delivering 1-to-1, as opposed to actually we've got 32 or 40 in the night, and they've been doing their cooking, and they've been building that relationship, and we've managed to support them in conflict resolution. Because we know what it's like, particularly in the teenage years, when they're, you know, particularly in S1 and 2, when the relationships are changing with peer groups and all that, there's all this conflict, and they've maybe not got the skill set yet to manage that, and that's where we come in as youth workers to try and help them through that. But I just wonder what a funder would say, saying, look, we're patching that for a bit, and we're just going to do 1-to-1s, and we're going to try and engage with young people that aren't accessing anything. And I do think there's a challenge in there, because I still believe there are a good number of young people accessing youth work and youth provision, and I think the youth clubs do a great service. And I just know that there's definitely a wee undercurrent's the wrong word, but a wee missed group there a wee missed opportunity there to maybe engage with some they've maybe never been, so they maybe, you know, they've maybe never experienced it. And how would we target them to get ourselves along?
Yeah, it's difficult. It all comes down to money, doesn't it, realistically? But we shouldn't have to look to funders to fund these places. You know, our government should be putting in this money. You know, one of the themes we're going to discuss today is inspiring a new generation. If we can't fund places like youth centres, then what hope have we got for these kids? And that's ensuring that clubs like the Citadel are readily available for kids. I know Hamza Yusuf was down at Spartans last year, and he talked about making football affordable. I don't know how much he's done about that. So we maybe need less talk from the politicians and more action. It's difficult because they'll work with such finite resources, and we can speak all we want about youth clubs, but you know, there'll be teachers out there in schools that think, well, no, we deserve a raise. And you look at health workers, and well, no, we're working X amount of hours, we deserve a raise. So they're working with finite budgets. But everything we've talked about today is interlinked. You know, if you've got kids that are sitting at home on their phone, you know, all evening after they get home from school, then they're going to be more susceptible to mental health. That has a knock-on effect on the health service. And you know, there's waiting lists for services like CAMS, for example, to help with young people. So these are all interlinked, and I think grassroots community centres, you know, I keep going back to the Citadel, and there'll be countless examples across Scotland, but funding these places is absolutely pivotal. I can't stress that enough.
I mean, there's a lot of good work out there. I think we have to recognise that. If you look at SAMH, you mentioned CAM, but SAMH, obviously for people that don't know, that's the Scottish Association for Mental Health. They do collaborate with youth initiatives. They deliver a lot of mental health awareness and training and support for young people. But you know, when we're looking at the mental health challenges facing young people nowadays, you know, that is a finite pot as well. You know what I mean? And that go between.
I mean, the example that it sticks in my mind there is something that happened just a few weeks ago. Now, I remember babysitting for a family I must have been about 10 years ago, and I remember I used to go there, and they literally just used to sit on their iPads the whole time. I'd barely speak to them, and then they'd go up to their bed, and I'd think to myself, like, wow, like that seemed concerning all those years ago, and it's the amount it's accelerated since then is absolutely bonkers. And the club that I take on a Thursday night is kids aged 19 to 13, and there's a lassie from Sudan that's come over, and she was telling me about the conflict that's going on in her home country, and she's telling me about people that have died, and she's showing me videos on TikTok and all that. I was thinking, that was even nearly in my mind at 12 years old. You know, I was out playing football till it got dark, and then you'd come home, you'd be climbing trees, you can play football. I know it's. I don't like people that are like, oh, the good old days, I never used to worry about that. Like, time's changing, that's fine. But I just think about how much of a damage that must be having to young people, and this obsession with getting likes and attention off other people, this constant seeking of attention through digital platforms. Like, it's unhealthy for adults. I can't imagine how unhealthy that is for a kid. And to think that they're inspired by people that sit in their bedroom and are influencers because of daft shit they do in their bedroom or whatever. Like,
ironically, as we sit here recording a podcast.
Yeah, no, I know. But we're
I know what you mean.
them. But no,
yeah,
but like,
I know what you mean.
Like, if that's who you look up to as a kid, then just the damage that has on their social skills is immense. Like when I was 12 years old, I used to look up to Scott Brown or whatever, just to hit you back with a Hibs comment. But
nice guy, to be fair.
But no, but that's what I looked up to as a kid. Or like I used to cut about with my cousin and his pals that were a bit older. I used to love cutting about with them, and we were always out doing something. And that's it's just a crazy thought that kids go home and just spend hours of the day. Now I know, to be fair, we had video games back in my day as well. To be fair, I mean, I wasn't obsessed with them, but some kids are.
Aye.
But to think that all of them, that's all they do now. Like, we had MSN when we were younger, and when that first came out, it was like quality. But it was always an arranged time. It was always like, right, I'll see you on MSN at like 7, because if we weren't all on at the same time, we couldn't speak to each other on it.
Aye.
So it wasn't like having a phone where you could text them and get back to them whenever. It was always like a set time, and you had to be there on. And you'd have that hour where everyone's on it, and you'd be speaking to whoever's in your ear and all that. But it wouldn't consume your whole day. How you combat that probably isn't necessarily to do with youth work, because I think youth clubs are a really effective mechanism of taking phones away from them, because they're just not concentrating them when they're at the youth club. Okay, you get the odd kid that's sitting there and they're a bit bored what's going on, and we're there to intervene, say, oh, do you want to do this, do you want to do that, and that sort of takes them away from their screen for at least 2 hours of their day. But to think without that is their sort of default mechanism is just crazy.
You talk there about cutting about with people.
Exactly.
That's a great
or like
great
going in for someone.
Going in for us. I say that to people now. I came in for you.
Aye.
I'm 43 years old. I was a Bebo generation.
Yeah.
Before MSN and that. But I think.
I had Bebo as well. To be fair.
Did you? Aye. Shocker. But we'll not talk about that too much. But what I think you're talking about there that I think is really important, particularly around mental health and where youth work can play a role, is human connection, right?
100%. That's the underlying theme, yeah.
You're talking there about cutting about with your older cousins, you're talking about meeting up. Back in MSN, I bet, if you really reflect, I bet there was a wee bit of anxiety about I better be on at the right time or I'm going to miss out.
Aye, yeah.
You know what I mean? You maybe not thought about much, but I bet there was if you were back at the time. But I think you're right. I think what youth clubs give people is that chance for human connection, right? And I think you get human connection between your peer group, the young people around about your age, not necessarily the same age as you, but you know, various age groups, relationships with adults that isn't a teacher, that isn't a parent, and we know that their relationships can have their challenges. Just given the nature, you know, there's an authoritarianism, but just by default in them relationships. Whereas again, as youth workers, we all know, and anybody listening would know that it's an equal transaction. So I think what we're talking about there is that really trying to provide human connection. When I'm thinking the mental health and the challenges, because you know people talk till we're blue in the face about COVID, that is undoubtedly, like I see behaviours in young people that I can only imagine as a result of that isolation that they maybe felt, you know, during the time of lockdown and stuff like that, and losing people and not being able to give people a cuddle or even high five people or see people or whatever. So I definitely think that youth work's got a role to play post pandemic. I definitely think it's got a role to play just in bringing people together, so that you've got a human being speaking and looking in the eye like we're doing now, looking and properly conversing. And I think that can only be a positive in terms of people's mental health. But what I do guard against, and I speak to youth workers, and I like to think youth workers are good at it. I like to think youth workers recognise that they're youth workers and they're no therapists and they're no psychologists.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That they're a friendly ear that can signpost in the right direction, and that'll do their best to safeguard and look after people's well-being. And if we've got young people and they're constantly on their screens, or maybe they're just cutting about the street but they're not attending youth clubs, who's actually then looking after their well-being and their mental health in that regard? Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. And you talked about being anxious about getting on MSN or Bebo at a certain time, but you weren't paranoid about it. Like if something went viral if you were younger, like I can't even imagine how anxious that would make you feel. I mean, it would make you feel anxious now, never mind as a kid. So that all-consuming nature of it, and it's no surprise that these people that created these digital platforms, your Steve Jobs, etc., your Mark Zuckerbergs, they curb how much time their kids spend on it to a really rigid level because they know how addictive and stuff it is. And there's a story in that. If they have created it and feel the need, knowing how dangerous it is, then we should all be doing that. And I know it's difficult because that creates a cycle of, if you take the phone off them, then they're struggling without it because everyone else has got it, and then that creates a conflict between you and the parents. So I don't know how we do it aside from like our government putting big pressure on these big firms to ban it for a certain age or whatever, probably beyond the scope of this podcast, Kenny. But it's a massive concern. I go back to that kid that was talking about Sudan and the conflict and all that, and I'm just thinking, I look at what's going on in Gaza just now, and it actually makes me so sad just listening to it and looking at the news. For that kid to be consumed by that at that age, it's just scary at me. They should have much more innocent thoughts at that stage of their life. It shouldn't be as heavy as that. And
would you suggest that again, that's what youth work does? I look at things like, another thing that youth work does would be residentials, right? So young people getting away, because what I think we're talking there is how do young people get that escapism. So
it's massive, yeah.
So them getting that time with you, cooking, but it's not just cooking. They're learning a life skill, potentially learning a life skill, which is that informal education that underpins youth work. But they've also got that conversation and that wee chance to escape. I read somewhere, and forgive me, I didn't have the citation. I couldn't tell you where I read it, but I read somewhere recently that the number of young people going on school camp and residentials has decreased massively. And I read that it was for a couple of reasons. I read one was young people's anxiety about being away, and also parental anxiety about their young people being away. And interestingly, phones came up that a lot of parents would say, I'll just give them their phone just in case they need to phone me, or in case I need to get them. So that when I'm reading that, I'm reading there's an anxiety on the young person's part of being away, there's an anxiety on the parents' part of being away, and they can't live without that connection to each other, even over phone. And I just think if that report's true, I think what a shame, because I think when I see the benefit of young people going away in these residentials, it can be transformative for them. And the relationship you have as a youth worker, spending a week away with a young person, you get to know them on a much deeper level than just standing for 45 minutes cooking macaroni cheese or baking cakes, right? Absolutely. You get a much deeper level of relationship. And again, we're talking about mental health. Again, we're no therapists and we're no psychologists, but there must be something in that supporting young people's mental health to get away from that pressure of school, to get away from their screens, to get away even from parents, potentially siblings and whatnot. And if we didn't have youth work, who's doing that now then? Because I didn't know if schools are reducing it, for my understanding, or parents are being priced out of sending their kids to school camp as another factor. Yeah. Who's going to do it then if that doesn't happen in youth work? Because that might be that young person's only break in the whole year.
Yeah, well, I was about to say, Kenny, just to sort of echo that point you just made there, I think poverty and austerity is a massive factor. Listen, schools they're strapped for cash. You've got a lot of sort of special needs schools that are closing down, and that's putting extra pressure on public schools right across Scotland. So there's probably not extra money available for things like trips. Parents are worse off than they were 10 years ago, for example. There's also the problem with kids going to school without eating properly, or without coming from a home that's heated properly, so they're not ready to learn. All these factors go into it, and I think this all impacts on what's available for these extra trips as well. And you talk about how special these trips are, and like we went to Aberfeldy at school, and these trips, when you form a deeper connection with your peers and all that, is really important for them. But yeah, poverty and austerity is a massive factor to play, because there's just not enough money in the system for these kind of things, and it's a shame that it's come to that. But yeah, I think kids can afford a phone and everything else, but that's about it. And I don't think it's a coincidence that in sort of my dad's generation, kids were a lot happier than their parents, because they were free from worry or stress, whereas their older generations were working. That's actually a reverse trend now. Kids are unhappier than their parents. That's a worrying statistic. I think it was a American doctor speaking about it in the news just last week. And kids are poorer. The gap between what was available to kids 30-40 years ago and what's available to them now is there's not much there for kids now. The prospect of becoming wealthier than your parents has gone down massively. Kids don't believe in themselves either. And added to that is this mobile phone they're looking at people and all the glamour that is plastic, by the way, but is on social media. That impacts their belief and self-confidence as well. So you have this perpetual cycle. But again, I go back to, it all comes down to money. And if there's no money for these trips that gives them that escapism from their routine that isn't working for them, then you're struggling.
I think I couldn't agree more. You're pushing against an open door with me. Obviously we're youth workers, and I think people listening would agree with sort of everything you're saying there. I want to move it on. We could talk about mental health for forever, right? It's such a widespread issue right now, and again we could go down other wee routes in talking about that. But I just want to take it on a wee bit into, you were keen to speak to me about your belief that youth work makes our streets safer. Can you elaborate a wee bit on that?
Yeah, I think it's not a really complicated notion. It's just that it just keeps kids off the streets. When I think back to when I was a teenager, if you were just cutting about doing nothing, that would enhance your likelihood to turn to things like drink or drugs or whatever, because you had nothing else to do. So looking for these things was a natural thing, because there's nothing else to do anyway. So kids don't keep themselves occupied by, I don't know, climbing trees or whatever. The culture's changed. There's so much influence with things like alcohol and drugs and stuff, that I think if you're not in these camps during the summer or in evenings or the weekends, then you're just more likely to get tied up in these things. So that's why I think youth work's really important.
I think linked to that as well, you're talking about the camps and that, and again it's a slight tangent, but it links. If you've not had much to eat, now you've not got a camp to go to, you're finding a way to getting something to eat, right? Yeah. So that leads to maybe a bit of trouble in the supermarket or whatever. I know a couple of projects that were set up as a result of a couple of young people had been sort of caught shoplifting, and they went to the youth club and they heard about this and like, look, what are you doing that for? And it's like, I'm just starving. Yeah. So obviously it goes hand in hand. The youth club then were proactive, and they put on food at these times, and I think we're seeing a lot of sort of food poverty and whatnot, and initiatives to try and tackle food poverty across the youth work sector. And you're the political sort of analyst, you know what I mean? You could go on about that for ages, I'm sure, but again, you talk about money and these things going hand in hand, but I definitely think that safe space in terms of the youth club, the mental health, and the streets being safer, I think they all tie into each other. 100%.
And you look at after the pandemic, or I think it was during the pandemic, where you seen big crowds of kids fighting each other in Porty and that, or in the meadows or whatever. That's because they've been tied up in their house for so long, and then they're suddenly let out. That just shows you what can happen to kids when their minds aren't, elsewhere, or, kept enthused by something or motivated by something out with their school. Like they can easily lose the plot. And I think if you're hanging about doing nothing, if there's like crowds of kids like that, that could lead to violence as well. I mean, in my day there was always young teams in that. We get chased out of parks, and then you find another park, you get chased out of that park as well, and or you'd fight to stay there or whatever. I just think that I think that's more speaking to my own experience, that if I'd had things to do and safe places to be, I wouldn't have had to worry about that or be involved in that. I was never a fighter. I could have easily been, and that would have got me in a lot more trouble than I was when I was 14, 15. But if you don't have these places, then kids are just cutting about the street, and with that, they turn to things like alcohol, drugs and violence, because there's nothing else to do. So if we're not keeping their minds occupied with something that's motivational and good for their health, then they're going to turn to things that aren't.
One of the things that I've noticed with speaking to young people, varying ages, is like when I was wee, you getting the people for your bit. Now, we didn't have the social media, and we didn't have the access to the internet. That's how old I am. I'm 43. We didn't even have proper access to the internet, right? So you went in for your pals, and you hang around, and you go big missions, right? That's what we do. But young people now, they know people from completely different areas that they've never met. And when I first was speaking to young people about that, I found it absolutely bizarre that kids from your house would know every facet and detail of a young person from Nidri. Whereas we used to get up the bus, obviously, chance we're lucky walking around their area, and you know what I mean. If you got away with it, you're quite lucky, or vice versa. But they actually know each other, and they're able to then, like you say, that thing at Porty was quite well publicised. That there was at the Meadows didn't end well for some folk, and I think that's it's certainly a new thing for me. Speaking to young people about that, how they literally know what people are. They're cutting about with people for different bits, and they know people for different bits. Does that make the streets safer, or does it make it more dangerous, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Because echoing that, I was sort of I sort of got the dregs of that generation. I was sort of the last of generations that had that sort of territorial thing, and the technology we had like Bluetooth, and you used to Bluetooth tunes to each other. That was like the Sony Ericssons and all that.
That blew my mind. I moved from Snake to Bluetooth. I couldn't believe it.
So that was the sort of tail end of it. And before that, you had sort of territories. You just wouldn't go outside your area. It was just a known thing. Whether that makes it safer or not, I don't know. I mean, if they all know each other, I guess that negates some of the possibility of just seeing them randomly and just wanting to fight them because you either recognise them. I guess it does. I think one thing that is dangerous though is that the exposure that you get from social media, from video and stupid shit, basically, because you see the amount of like videos of people getting battered and all that on social media now. That's really dangerous, and they're getting encouraged by the exposure they're getting on social media. The more sort of ridiculous it is, the more chance of going viral. So instead of getting, instead of having a fight with someone and learning the consequence, right, you didn't go in that area and that's it, that's the end of it, you actually get a positive validation from it because you're off chance getting a video and you're posting it and you're getting loads of likes and comments and reactions, so it's like a positive reaction to something like that. Do you understand what I mean?
So what's Youth Work's role there then?
I think, in simple terms, it's taking them away from that situation. But I think, listen, youth workers can't do everything. But I think when they're in a safe environment like a youth club, like I've talked to the kids about fights they've been in and whatever, and they speak about their emotions and why they did it and how it made them feel, I think that's a benefit because you can edge them in the right direction to say, right, well, was that clever? Like, did you get anything from hitting that guy? Or whatever it is, and making them properly think about their actions and how that might affect them, I guess, would be a case for youth work intervening in that kind of scenario. But listen, that's an issue that's multifaceted and way beyond the scope of just one element of education. Like, that needs to be a renowned thing to tackle that sort of phenomenon. Like, youth work can't do it on its own. We need to really invest in education. We need to invest in policing and everything that comes with it. That's not just something that youth work can do, but it can certainly help.
I like how you mentioned there having that conversation later on, because I remind everybody when I speak to them about the role of a youth worker isn't actually to tell young people what to do. It's to challenge their thinking and to support them.
Feeling and encouraging them to learn it themselves.
Yeah, and reflect and learn from experiences and whatnot. Young people have throughout history, they've experimented with alcohol and drugs and sex and violence and everything else that comes with being young. But sometimes what's been lacking for them has been that friendly adult, that friendly role model that can help guide them and break down what's went in their thinking, to help them move on and sort of critique themselves and develop themselves as people. So I definitely think there's a scope for that. But I think if we're saying that youth work makes the streets safer, then what are we saying? Are we saying that we're more likely to have unsafer streets if youth work didn't exist? Is that basically the argument that you're giving me?
I think so, yeah. Because you would have, I think, where we don't invest in education and like rehabilitation in a sense, where we're encouraging kids to learn from their experiences and speak about their feelings and everything that comes with that, what you're investing in is punishment. You'd be investing in policing and making it a negative thing rather than a positive experience and learning from it. And I think the more we punish kids, the more they respond in a deflective manner. In a way that is sort of, I'm struggling for my words, but
I think I know where you're going, right? One thing that I'm a massive believer in, and I've been criticised for this for certain people, right? But I will not bar people, right? I will not bar them for youth clubs, right? Now, there might be a situation where the consequence might be like you've got to miss a week, right? Or you've got to have a restorative chat, or you might have to come and volunteer, and that volunteering tends to be with a youth worker cleaning something or doing a wee job, you know what I mean? So it's an excuse to get one-to-one chat, right? I do not see any benefit whatsoever to young people being barred for youth clubs and youth services, right? Because ultimately that's what the youth club's there for, that's what the youth service is there for. If we're deciding that we're barring young people, where else then did it have to go? And where I would go with your take on youth work making the streets safer, if young people are barred for one youth club and then another, and they're potentially non-school, and they're potentially even barred for their house or wherever they're staying, they're effectively barred for society. And I've yet to see anybody over the next few years, when it happens to them, end up in a positive place, right? Some make it back and they can turn it around. It's usually turned around as a result of that relationship with a key person, maybe gets back in contact, or they bump into each other, or the young person makes that move to, oh look, can I have a chat with you, right? But I've never ever seen a success for a young person when they're barred for places. So if we're talking about the streets being safer, if you've got a group of young people that are barred for everywhere, right? And even in some holidays, they're not barred for school, but school's known, right? If we're using holidays as an example, we need things on for them, because if they're no, they feel excluded for society, and that's young people telling me that, and that's young people been telling me that for 20 years, particularly the young people on the fringes and on the edges, and the ones that they would say are at risk. So where I'm agreeing with your point about youth work plays a role in keeping our streets safer, that's really where I go. Young people need safe spaces where they can go, and that doesn't matter who they are, because the wee quiet one that comes along and gets home with baking the cakes, they need their input, absolutely right, and the input to them is as equally valuable to the input of somebody who's been barred for everywhere. They're both equally as valuable, but they both equally deserve that space. You know what I mean by that?
Yeah, we need to steer them away from having a toxic relationship with society more generally. If every sense of authority that they come across is a negative one, then how are they going to develop into a sort of valued member in society more generally? Do you know what I mean? I think that's the point I was getting at. Instead of having a toxic relationship, I talked about a further investment in police as opposed to youth services, where you rehabilitate rather than punish. If every encounter you have with authority is if getting chucked out of school or coming across a police officer that's looking to nick you or whatever, then you're going to be inherently skeptical of society, and you're not going to want to contribute to society in a positive way. And I think if we teach people in that way, then we're setting up a generation of people that don't want to contribute, if that makes sense. So I'm repeating myself a wee bit.
No, that's fine, but I think it links into your next point. Obviously, we're going to look at inspiring the next generation, and I think that ties or links us really well into that.
Yeah.
So talk to me about your thoughts on that when we discussed what we were, or when we sort of hinted at and had a wee brief discussion about what we were going to discuss today. That was something that you wanted to put in here. So what was your thinking behind that?
Yeah, I think it sort of ties in with all the themes we've discussed so far. I think we're at a juncture in society. I think we're all in the understanding that social media is getting a little bit over consuming. I think that there's been a lot of positive developments in how we speak about mental health and encouraging, people to speak about their emotions, and I think we're at a point now where we need to have an outlook of, how do we really inspire young people. And I look at younger generations now who I think are a bit lost. I think they don't see the opportunities that older generations would have seen when they were younger. I talked about that statistic about older generations being happier than younger generations now. I think we're at a juncture where we need to ask ourselves, how do we encourage young people to really have belief in their own community and what it has to offer for them? And I think what comes with that is investment in services, not just in youth work. We talked about how scarce, policing and healthcare is and everything, but it just doesn't seem that enjoyable to be a teenager at the moment. Their mental health is so precarious. They seem more stressed than they should be for their age. They're more aware about societal issues, but is that a good thing? Should their minds not be a bit more innocent? I talked about how I walk around the streets of Leith and I never see kids playing anywhere. So I think we're at a point in society where we need to rejig how we're treating everything, essentially. I think our services are kind of running to the ground, and part of that's investment, but part of it's just how we actually run things and how we treat people. And we're obsessed with economics and GDP and all this, but why don't we start looking at happiness as a society? How do we actually inspire young people to be happy and feel valued and see a future for themselves in Scotland? I think that's the kind of sentiments I was thinking of when I was coming into the podcast.
I think when you're, when I'm hearing you there, it's making me think of the people that helped me be happy as a wee boy. Everybody's got a backstory. Everybody's got their childhood traumas and whatnot. Growing up, sort of amused with a single mum with her mental health issues and whatnot. It was challenging, but there were people for the community, older people who had grown up in the area, who kind of took you under your wing, a real community spirit. You know what I mean? And maybe where that's eroded, is that possibly where youth work can step in? Because what I see in a lot of youth centres is a lot of the staff have been young people at the place, have maybe then volunteered and have got some qualifications and experience, and they become the staff. So it used to be the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. I think that was the saying. Is that right? We didn't have so many villages now. Like you say, the world's so opened up and so wide. How can youth work in those role models? How can they play a positive impact then, do you think, on our young people? Yeah,
I think learning from your own experience is really important. So I think the reason that I wanted to keep connected to youth work, we've obviously mentioned the podcast that I've got just now, and I'm very much in politics, but what made me want to keep going with youth work is to ensure that my story's heard for other young people. I went to university after I left school. I had the grades too, so it was encouraged for me to do that. I'm grateful for it. I didn't really see the benefit of it much at the time.
Until Freshers Week.
Well, yeah. That was a good laugh, don't get me wrong, but I think, I sort of felt lost at times. I sort of questioned the purpose of it when I was there, and I remember coming out of university feeling so lost and being in that, really in the start of the overdrive of social media, of how powerful Instagram was, and looking at people's stories, and you'd come across loads of folk that are like going, yeah, I'm going travelling to X, Y, and Z, I'm going to all these countries, and you see pictures of them abroad, and you're sitting thinking like, you can't even imagine it. You're just like, how is that even possible? And you know, I went through sort of, you know, what ended up a toxic relationship with my ex-girlfriends who, you know, we got on really well. It just didn't end well, and I think we both suffered from mental health issues, and I think that played a part of it. We were both kind of lost in how we seen our life and the opportunities that were in front of us. You know, I've spoken openly about how I've got ME, and it was exacerbated quite badly by long COVID, which was tough, and that took a real toll on my mental health as well. And I went through a real sort of difficult 3 or 4 years there, where I think young people like I once was could really benefit from hearing. And you know, I had to, you know, I had a lot of inward thinking to do. You know, I had to ask for help, which was always difficult, especially for young men who feel a sense of pride, and you know, because of societal, you know, norms and expectations. Like men, I feel like men feel a lot more lost in modern society because gender expectations are changing. And I just think what kept me to youth work was I really want young people to hear my story and the kind of emotions that I felt. And even for someone that was, you know, we weren't struggling for money when I was a kid. But that, you know, it's still okay not to be okay, even if you have had a lot of benefits in life. And I think it's just important that people hear stories like mine who have struggled, despite having the, you know, the pleasure going to, you know, at university, for example. It's okay not to be okay, and spreading that message. And I lost a pal of mine, unfortunately, a couple of years ago now. I think it might be more, which was really tough. And I see statistics of, you know, male suicide going up, for example. And I just think if we capture young kids young enough and really explain these things to them, then I think that could have a massive positive upward trajectory of how, you know, young people view their life. You know, we talk quite flippantly about mental health, but when you think about people that are ending their own life and how serious it can get, you know, it's a really pressing issue. And I feel like obliged of someone that's went through difficulties in my own mental health to spread that message. And I think that's what's kept me connected. And I think if we encourage more and more people to give back to their community, if you experience trauma like that, to go and help out at their local youth centre, even once a week, just take an hour to speak to young kids and capture them early so they understand when they go through these things, because they're in a much different place, as we've talked about so much today, Kenny, as our parents were. Like, they didn't have digital mobiles. Their world was their area, and that was it. They were worry free. So it's imperative that we capture young people as young as possible, ensure that they're emotionally intelligent as young as possible, and when they're feeling lost in the world and they look around them and they don't see much opportunity, to keep at it and just believe in themselves and believe something that's happening. And I think what's brilliant what you're doing, Kenny, is you know, you talked about how someone was saying, oh, I thought you were going to start a podcast, and then you're going, no, you know what, I'm going to do that. And inspiring young kids to be like the same. If you've got an idea about something, just do it. Don't be scared. Just do it and throw your weight at it. And I think that's really important. So sorry, I'm rambling now. But
no, honestly, I'm really powerful, and I'm sitting there listening and going, it's kind of went full circle in terms of, because you touched there again on the mental health and the safe space and all this, but your story is absolutely spot on, I think, because young people need to see Innes Burns. They need to see people like yourself working in these places. They need to know your story. Yeah. They need to understand that that's all right. They need to know that they'll find a way out of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Particularly with everything that we've touched on today. I want to just finish up, I think, by saying, you know, we often talk a lot about what the young people benefit for youth work, right? But listening to you there, and I've said this a few times to folk, people didn't understand what us as youth workers get out of being youth workers and what the
Yeah.
young people bring to us.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I mean? And I've felt so humbled and so many emotions. Been lucky enough to be trusted by young people to share their deepest concerns and moments and celebrations and just be part of their wee journey. And I kind of maybe sounds cheesy, but it's so true. Like, I think we get equally as much out of being a youth worker as what hopefully they do for us being that friendly role model. And I think you've just absolutely nailed that, what that looks like. And anybody, I think, working with you in a Citadel and benefiting from your experience and your nature and your experience, I think they're very, very lucky.
There's nothing new under the sun, Kenny, and if you've got a worry about something, or you feel like a problem to you is unique and you don't know how you're going to get out of it, there's the chances are someone near you has been through the exact same thing. And I think that's why it's so important to encourage people to talk, because a problem said is a problem halved. And I think if these young kids are able to hear from youth workers like myself, as I said, and show that emotions that they're going through is normal, you know, that might not solve the problem for them, but just hearing that is so beneficial for people. And I think back to important times where I end up reaching out to people and hearing from others and speaking about their experiences. Just hearing that was life changing for me, literally life changing for me. I think that's really important. I think we can learn from that, and we're labouring the point, but if we capture kids early and really harness that emotional intelligence from an early age, I think you'll see a generation of kids being a lot happier than they are now. And they need more protection, because this thing that we're staring at, these laptops, these screens, these mobile phones, they're out of control at the moment. They need more protection, and we need people like us to step in.
And I can't thank you enough for coming on to the show today.
No worries at all.
Honestly, such a powerful message, and I just want to actually, on the back of that, I want to thank all the youth workers that are out there. Thanks for your dedication, your passion, your efforts for the young people in Scotland to make it a better place. And the thing you said there, to coin what you said there, was, if we can help young people nail their emotional intelligence, I'm not sure we might change lives. I think we might actually save lives. So, Innes, thank you very much.
No worries at all, Kenny. And just to add to